Remember when I said I was going to do a series of videos on the War of 1812? That I made two and never really made more? The three people who watched the first two have never let me forget it. So after months and months of waiting, here we go. Perhaps the most ferocious yet gentlemanly action of the age of sail was the 15-minute action off Boston between the USS Chesapeake and the HMS Shannon. In only 15 minutes, over 80 men were killed on the two ships, and at the end of it, one ship lay captured, crippled and broken, and the other damaged and victorious. It was a brutal, bloody, and horrific, yet somewhat respectful at the same time, affair. A real oddity when we consider just how crap warfare truly is. It is a strange thing sitting in the 21st century to imagine a world where the United Kingdom and the United States were engaged in open conflict with one another, but it is important to note the alliance between the two is a relatively modern concept. The two nations only formalising their current symbiotic relationship in the trenches of the Western Front during the latter days of the First World War, and reaffirming it during the Second. During the Age of Sail, in particular the War of 1812, it was a radically different situation. Merely 30 years prior, the United States declared its independence from the British Empire in 1776, and this war heralded the end for what is best described as the First British Empire. However, a goal of many of the patriots, which should be kept in mind is a pretty derogatory term at the time used against the Americans, so was loyalist and the other way around, during the Revolutionary War, was the absorption of the remaining loyal northern British colonies into the United States, who, I cannot stress enough, did not want to be part of the United States. They actively did not want to be part of the United States. The attempt to get what would become Canada to join the revolution was first thwarted with the defeat of Benedict Arnold in the Quebec campaign, before he got all traitory and such, but the sentiment remained in the US, along with, in Canada, a fear that they may again face invasion from the south. The War of 1812 is seen as a minor war for many of the Europeans, and with good reason, for at the same time as this war was burning across the Atlantic, almost like a small candle, Europe was comparatively a raging inferno, with the self-crowned Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte at its core. The war is strange, as all those who took part in the war view it remarkably differently. The British, as previously mentioned, saw the war as a mere sideshow, many of their generals commenting just as such, including Wellington. It's very hard to understate just how annoyed they were at the fact that they had to go to war. Whereas the Canadian and American view is widely different. Canadians often see the war as a struggle to maintain their independence in the face of American aggression and really the birth of a Canadian national identity. Whereas the Americans view the war as a second war of independence, which absolutely makes no sense, and it wasn't because nobody in the United Kingdom with a brain considered the possibility of reconquering the former colonies. It wasn't going to happen. Beginning in, unsurprisingly, the year of 1812, because we're good at naming like that, the war began on the 18th of June 1812 after the diplomatic relationship between the United States and the British had, while continuing to deteriorate for many years, finally broken down. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Empire had maintained a complete blockade of the French Empire and her allies. This blockade involved the stop and possible seizure of any vessel making its way to or from any belligerent country. It's worth noting, and this is taken directly from Ian W. Toll's fantastic book Six Frigates, that the United States was, comparatively speaking for the time, an incredible powerhouse at sea when it comes to merchant marine. It didn't have the Navy to back it up yet because it was such a new country, but in terms of sea power, it's really hard to understate just how much the United States had in terms of merchant marine. Additionally, at this time, the Royal Navy, due to its size, relied on, to an extent, press gangs to crew its hundreds upon hundreds of ships, and some Americans were forced to serve against their will in the Royal Navy. Now, a lot is made of this, and yes, it absolutely happened. However, the amount of Americans who were forced to serve on Royal Navy ships is not as high as many would have you believe. It's actually quite a small amount when you consider the overall size and scope of the Royal Navy crews. And it is also worth noting that this policy had ceased by the time war was declared, but it was still used as a casus belli by Washington when they decided that the war was a good idea, after the president had spent the last few years of his term just cutting the US military non-stop. And although the war ended with the maintenance of the status quo, the War of 1812 contained some of the most fascinating and incredible naval actions between the super frigates of the new United States Navy and the Royal Navy. And it is here we find the story of Captain Lawrence of the USS Chesapeake and Captain Broke of the HMS Shannon. As with all naval tales, the outcome of this engagement was largely decided by the tenacity and the intellect of its two captains and their respected crews. Both of them highly competent. And make no mistake, although one wins in the end, it's not a guaranteed affair. Captain Lawrence and Captain Broke were both incredibly competent seamen, both incredibly competent captains, and they knew what they were doing. The Battle of Boston Harbour was not merely a battle between the Royal Navy and the United States Navy, but it was a fight between two men, and their respective styles of captaincy, and well, it came down to a lot of luck as well, and I'm going to tell you a bit about them both now. Philip Broke was born in the somewhat auspicious year for what he would accomplish of 1776, near Ipswich in the United Kingdom, and he joined the Royal Navy at a young age in 1788, before beginning active service as a midshipman in 1792. Unusually for this time period, Broke would receive formal naval training. The norm was for boys to go to sea young and receive an on-the-job style of training. Such was the belief at large in the British Navy at the time that the best officers were truly moulded from experiences in combat, and not in the classroom. You know, teach them how to blow up the French young and you're all kind of set. That kind of mentality. Broke served as a third lieutenant on the Royal Navy frigate HMS Southampton at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797. That's where Nelson did his shenanigans and screamed Westminster Abbey or glorious victory, before being promoted to commander in 1799 and captain in 1801. Shortly thereafter, in 1806, the now Captain Philip Broke took command of the 38-gun Leader-class frigate HMS Shannon, on which he would etch his name into the pantheon of great British naval commanders. Captain Broke held command of the HMS Shannon for a very long time, and during this period he began to enact a series of reforms to the way his ship's crew undertook gunnery and hand-to-hand combat. Many of these reforms were centralised around practical improvements to the great 18-pounder long guns of the Shannon. For simplicity, there's three major kinds of guns we sort of look at during this period. You have your long guns, which can hit things far away, your middle-of-the-range guns, which can hit many things, just not as far away and were a bit lighter, and lastly, the big ye olde shotgun, the carronade. Broke had specialised dispart sights fitted to the cannons, improving the ability to aim the long guns, which was often thrown off by the narrowing of the gun's barrel from muzzle to breech. The erstwhile captain also added tangent sights and elevating quinions or wedges of wood placed in specific spots under the breech of the cannon to improve elevation and accuracy. These reforms would prove vital in the future. Similarly, the naval equivalent of the shotgun, the carronade that I mentioned before, were given the same treatment. Lastly, Broke ensured that all guns would be able to be aimed at the horizon. At the time, ship's decks tended to slope a little, and the cannons were often aimed a little lower at the water or higher at the skyline, depending on their location, which is why when these ships fired, they would either fire on the up roll or the down roll, depending on where the waves were, to try and get the best sort of hits on the guns wherever they were aiming at. With these reforms, the Shannon was able to focus its firepower quite unlike any ship of the period, and the reforms to Shannon didn't just involve the ship. Broke would regularly have his gun crews compete in training to see who could hit the target with the most accuracy, and even went so far as to train them to fire down bearings with reasonable accuracy blindfolded. This is really the birth, in many ways, of director-fired gun control, and it's truly a fascinating thing. The captain would often have his crew thrown into completely hypothetical drills and situations just to test their reaction time, and actions to defend their ship. Broke did stop the crew from using shot and cutlass in these training drills, and instead the crew would fight with a method called single stick, essentially a shortened broomstick with a hilt. The game was painful, yes, but it wasn't fatal, and therefore the crew of HMS Shannon developed a skill at the quickness of their eye and their wrist. Before long, the Shannon had one of the greatest crews for boarding in any navy. She'd be known at the time as a crack frigate. With all this achieved, Captain Broke was ordered to the Canadian port of Halifax in 1811 as tensions rose. Across the Atlantic, and 5 years his junior, Captain Broke's greatest adversary was born in the year 1781 in New Jersey. James Lawrence, by contrast, had a somewhat harsher upbringing. His father had remained a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, and therefore at its conclusion had fled to Canada, and his mother died while James was still an infant. Lawrence was raised by his father's half-sister, and after a non-remarkable upbringing he first studied law before joining the fledgling United States Navy as a midshipman in 1798. Just as Captain Broke was making a name for himself as a commander. Serving aboard many US ships, Lawrence saw action during the Quasi-War with France, eventually being commissioned as a lieutenant in 1802, and Lawrence would command multiple vessels leading up to his command of USS Chesapeake, vessels ranging from small gunboats to the 20-gun sloop of war USS Hornet, following a promotion to Master Commandant in 1810. I'm sorry, but can we please bring back the old-style ranks? They were so much cooler. At the beginning of the War of 1812, still in command of the Hornet, Lawrence took the Hornet as far south as Bahia in Brazil to blockade the British sloop HMS Bon Citoyen in port. Lawrence sent a written challenge to the captain of Bon Citoyen, however the British ship declined the invitation to combat, and Lawrence withdrew disappointingly. The most notable action of Lawrence's tenure in command of the USS Hornet came on the 24th of February, 1813. On the morning of the 24th of February 1813, the 18-gun brig sloop HMS Peacock left harbour in British Guiana, shortly thereafter encountering Lawrence's USS Hornet. As Hornet gave chase, Peacock turned to fire a broadside, however her gunnery was quite poor and wildly inaccurate. This turn, which was likely given in order to damage Hornet and possibly capture her, however backfired, and Lawrence brought the Hornet with tremendous skill upon the starboard quarter of the Peacock and poured withering fire into her. Within minutes, her captain and many crew were dead, and the ship was mauled so viciously that she was sinking. 3 Americans who were press-ganged into service aboard the Peacock were liberated upon the Hornet, as she stopped to ferry survivors on board, one of which was Captain Lawrence's wife's cousin. The captured British sailors were sent back to Britain shortly thereafter, and Peacock's ensign was placed on display at the US Naval Academy. This action largely influenced the US Navy to promote Lawrence to the full rank of captain. He was then ordered, after a back and forth tenures at different places, to take command of the USS Chesapeake while the Hornet was refitting, which was preparing for sea, and the Chesapeake was sitting in Boston, just as HMS Shannon sailed south from Halifax. HMS Shannon and USS Chesapeake are 2 names that will forever be intertwined. The ships were of similar size and similar age at the time of their engagement, with Shannon first putting to sea in 1806 and Chesapeake in 1800. HMS Shannon was a leader-class 38-gun frigate, approximately 45 metres from stem to stern, and she sported a crew of 330 men and boys. The majority of her cannon were 18-pounder long guns with supporting 32-pound carronades and a pair of 9-pounders and smaller boat guns. Her opponent, USS Chesapeake, was 46 metres from stem to stern and armed with pretty much the same armament. However, instead of 9-pounders, she was fitted with extra 32-pound carronades. Chesapeake's advantage, in fact, was her larger crew at 370 men and boys. And now Chesapeake was one of the first 6 frigates authorised by Congress to form the backbone of the United States Navy, and originally was designed to be a much larger ship along the lines of the Constitution at 44 guns. Problems with construction and supplies and material, however, meant that she was completed to a smaller design of 36 guns, but instead was armed with 38. The fight ahead would undoubtedly therefore be decided by crew training and captain skill alone. As a side tangent, it's very common for US sailing ships to upgun themselves. So if they have a third rate that's armed for 74 guns, you can expect them to sit 84 on it. It's the most American thing in the world, but it's quite comical, and sometimes it has interesting results. By the day of the battle on the 1st of June, 1813, the American super frigates had scored a number of victories over the Royal Navy, the most famous of which the USS Constitution's astonishingly easy victory over HMS Guerriere on the 19th of August 1812, in which she got that nickname Old Ironsides. This began a swath of American victories in one-on-one frigate duels with the Royal Navy. The reasoning for these victories was down to design and crew skill. The American frigates, of which have been referred to in this text as super frigates, were designed to be larger than normal frigates of the time period in order to outgun their contemporaries, yet fast enough to outrun any larger ship that attacks them. For example, although the smaller HMS Guerriere at 38 guns was a grossly unfair fight for the British ship, the Constitution's 44 guns would be torn asunder by a British 74-gun ship of the line, for example HMS Vanguard, or the behemoth, first-rate HMS Victory, with over 100 guns. Captain Broke of the Shannon had these defeats in mind, and had the goal of defeating one of these American frigates in single combat to reinforce the Royal Navy as the most dominant naval force in the world, and to show that no matter how well built or lucky the American ships were, that Britannia would rule the waves. And on his side, it must be said, he had the British response in many ways. The later class frigates were no shrieking violets, and in response to the larger frigates built in the US and France at the time, the British were building the Endymion and her sisters and successors. Truth be told, the US super frigates are kind of a myth. They were just a little early and quite lucky. Somewhat like HMS Dreadnought in that regards, just not a lot smaller of a scale. They didn't change the way battle was fought, no, not like Dreadnought in that sense. They were just something new, they were powerful, and they were a bit early. Helped a lot by the fact that their captains were also highly competent, it must be said. Originally aiming to fight one of the larger American frigates, such as USS President, Captain Broke prepared a challenge. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, the President had slipped out of harbour under the cover of fog and a squall to undertake commerce raiding against the British merchant fleet. With Constitution still under extensive repair and receiving alterations after a series of naval actions, including the defeat of HMS Java, only the Chesapeake remained in condition to put to sea. With this in mind, Broke sailed the Shannon to Boston and prepared to offer single-ship combat. Whilst en route to offer the challenge, Shannon captured a small number of merchant vessels, with 2 of them being sent to Halifax. As previously mentioned, Broke prided himself on maintaining a well-trained and well-disciplined crew in order to maximise their effectiveness in combat. The capturing of said prizes had greatly diminished the crew of the Shannon, and Broke made the subsequent decision to burn any future prizes as he was anticipating the Chesapeake would accept his challenge. Broke, placing the Shannon outside of Boston Harbour, waited, and it seemed after some time that the Chesapeake would not leave and accept the challenge. Dismayed, he sent a written challenge in the same way Captain Lawrence had sent one earlier in his career. Broke's challenge was written as following: "As the Chesapeake now appears ready for sea, I request that you will do me the favour to meet the Shannon with her, ship to ship, to try the fortune of our respective flags. The Shannon mounts 24 guns upon her broadside and 1 light boat gun, 18-pounders upon her main deck and 32-pounder carronades upon her quarterdeck and forecastle, and is manned with a complement of 300 men and boys, besides 30 seamen, boys, and passengers who were taken out of recaptured vessels lately. I entreat you, sir, not to imagine that I am urged by mere personal vanity to the wish of meeting the Chesapeake, or that I depend only upon your personal ambition for your accepting this invitation. We both have noble motives. You will feel it as a compliment if I say that the result of our meeting may be the most grateful service I can render to my country, and I doubt not that you, equally confident of success, will feel convinced that it is only by repeated triumphs, and even in combats, that your little navy can now hope to console your country for the loss that its trade can no longer protect. Favour me with a speedy reply. We are short of provisions and water, and cannot stay for long." Captain Lawrence never received this invitation. Shortly before the boats carrying this challenge entered the harbour, the Chesapeake was seen setting sail, with 3 enormous American ensigns flying, and 1 large flag inscribed with Free Trade and Sailors' Rights. According to author Ian W. Toll, Lawrence had always intended to fight the Shannon, but was just waiting for a favourable wind. Although much is made of the frigate duels undertaken by the US Navy ships during this war, they were in fact against national interest. The Royal Navy could in a matter of months replace any ship or frigate the United States could hope to defeat, either by building or capturing it from the reserve fleet, also known as the French Navy. Whereas the United States, not even half a century old, could not. Lawrence was keenly aware that fighting the Shannon was not his prerogative, but perhaps spurred on by previous successes and misplaced ambition that the crews of the Shannon would be as poorly trained in gunnery as that of the earlier HMS Peacock, he set sail for the mouth of Boston Harbour, while scores of civilian onlookers lined the banks and set off in civilian boats to witness the action, confident of another roaring success. Shannon had been laying off Boston Harbour for 56 days, and as was stated in Broke's challenge, running quite low on provisions. As well as that, the Shannon, by proxy of being at sea for such a time, was starting to suffer the effects of fouling, reducing her speed and her manoeuvrability. By contrast, Chesapeake was fresh out of refit, and her crew outnumbered the British by over 40 men. Her crew, contrary to popular belief, was not largely fresh and untested, and although many of the sailors were new to Chesapeake, they weren't new to war at sea. There were no landsmen aboard, to put it bluntly. Further to that, Lawrence had undertaken multiple drills while in port, and he had noted the crew was well trained and was confident that he could achieve victory over the Shannon. The battle would be down to crew skill, captaincy, and honestly, a lot of luck. With that in mind, as Chesapeake's crew cheered and Bostonians stood in anticipation as she cleared Boston Harbour to bear down and chase the Shannon, who had raised her weather-worn blue battle ensign and her crew had beat to quarters. With Chesapeake approaching, Captain Broke, in full dress uniform, as was the norm of the time, addressed his crew. "Throw no shot away, aim every one, keep cool, work steadily, fire into her quarters, main deck to main deck, quarterdeck to quarterdeck. Don't try and dismast her, kill the men, and the ship is yours." At 5:30 on the 1st of June 1813, the 2 ships met approximately 37 kilometres east of the Boston Light. Shannon, in her worn state after being at sea for a long period of time, gave the impression that she would be yet another astounding American victory over the overrated Royal Navy. As Chesapeake approached Shannon, a sailor asked Broke why the Shannon was only flying a single battle flag, whereas the Chesapeake had 3, along with its particularly emotive white flag. Broke dismissed this as a mere triviality. In an oddly gentlemanly fashion that was particular of officers of the period, but we would sort of shirk our noses at now, Shannon refused to fire on Chesapeake as she made her approach, and in turn, Chesapeake did not take the opportunity to rake the stern quarters of Shannon, even though she had a clear advantage with the wind. The level of respect and honour between the officers of this period, of both enemy and friendly, is particularly commendable, and it is one of the many fascinating aspects of the Age of Sail. Shannon and Chesapeake bore alongside and opened fire upon each other at around 6 in the afternoon, when both ships were around 35 metres apart. Broke's gunnery training proving its worth, with one of Shannon's 18-pounders striking Chesapeake shortly after opening fire at one of her gun ports, with round shot and a grape shot of musket balls. At this point, Chesapeake had the speed advantage, and as she sailed alongside Shannon, the methodical gunnery practiced by Broke on a religious level tore her apart with alarming accuracy. Following the focus fire, which inflicted much damage upon the forward gun ports and the crew quarters of Chesapeake, the British gunners adjusted fire towards the stern. Chesapeake did not take this lying down and responded in kind with accurate fire, Lawrence's drills in port and her experienced crew paying dividends. However, due to the withering barrage inflicted by Shannon, Chesapeake was heeling, and her shots either fell short or caused little damage to the oak sides of Shannon. With her 18-pounders rendered largely ineffective, the Chesapeake's most meaningful response was her 32-pounder carronades, which tore the rigging of Shannon to shreds, with one shot striking a pile of shot stored for Shannon's 12-pounder boat gun and sending ammunition flying across the deck like hail. Taking stock of the situation, Captain Lawrence realised his ship was travelling too fast, and in no time at all it would be exposed to crippling fire to the stern quarters. He quickly ordered something known as a pilot's luff, a brief turn into the wind to spill it from his sails and thus reduce Chesapeake's speed. However, at this critical juncture, Broke's gunners again showed their worth. A broadside from Shannon killed much of the remaining crew of Chesapeake's quarterdeck, and in a flash taking away the ability of Chesapeake to manoeuvre, thus leaving her into the wind and laden irons. Following this, any hope of Chesapeake regaining the advantage was dashed, when a tactically placed 9-pounder on the quarterdeck of Shannon smashed Chesapeake's ship's wheel and killed her helmsman. The surviving American gunners fired back, and in fact did score hits on Shannon, destroying her ship's bell, killing 3 men and destroying the 9-pounder that inflicted so much damage upon them. Just as Chesapeake lost her helm, her topsail halyard on her foremast was completely shot away, and she luffed further and further into the wind, completely losing her forward momentum, so much so that the sails pressed backwards against the mast, and she began to sail in reverse into Shannon's starboard side, with Shannon's gun deck stuck together by way of one of Shannon's stowed anchors and Chesapeake's spanker boom. The American ship was trapped, exposed at the stern, and unable to manoeuvre. Shannon unleashed her full broadside weight into the Chesapeake, with the stern gun crews being wiped out, alike with the forward crews earlier in the battle. Unable to respond with cannon fire, the situation only got worse for Chesapeake, as a small cache of musket cartridges detonated on her upper deck near the mizzenmast. Judging the situation, Broke gave the order for his crew to board. Simultaneously, Lawrence gave the same order. However, because he was shaken and frightened, naturally so, the bugler on board the Chesapeake did not give the command, and only those in the immediate vicinity of Lawrence, who by now it should be noted was the last officer standing on the quarterdeck, heard the order. On board the Chesapeake, Lieutenant Cox brought up the men from below, and in a desperate attempt to form a boarding party as he reached the quarterdeck, he found Captain Lawrence, heeled over, clinging to the binnacle trying to stand. In the brief period between giving the order to board and being found, he had been mortally wounded by a musket ball. Cox had served with Lawrence his whole life and carried him down to the cockpit with assistance from 2 nearby crew. Captain James Lawrence's last words being heard were the now famous order, "Tell the men to fire faster, don't give up the ship." Comparatively speaking, it was relatively easy for Shannon to organise her boarding party, drilled by Broke for years on end aboard of the Chesapeake at an alarming rate, led personally by their captain. There were no sailors left alive on the quarterdeck where not so long before Captain Lawrence stood, and due to that, the British crews were able to gain a foothold on board. Similarly, the main deck was almost deserted following the Shannon's constant barrage. The majority of the crew left aboard Chesapeake had taken shelter below decks with responding to the call for boarders. Lieutenant Cox, returning from taking his captain to the ship's doctor, and a midshipman, fired the 2 rearmost 18-pounders on board, which they found was still aimed squarely at Shannon. Another wounded American officer, Lieutenant Ludlow, returned from treatment to the upper decks, rallying his crewmen. As he did so, Ludlow was able to organise an effective counterattack and push the British crew as far back as the binnacle, where Captain Lawrence had been shot. But just at the right time, a wave of reinforcements arrived from Shannon. Ludlow was mortally wounded with a cutlass, and the counterattack failed. Now severely lacking in leadership and without instruction, resistance aboard the Chesapeake began to fall apart. Only the forecastle and those posted to her fighting tops remained organised. Broke, rallying his men together, led the charge to capture Chesapeake's forecastle, and at the time 3 American sailors attacked the British captain, who was taken by surprise. He killed the first, the second was able to hit Broke with a musket and stun him, while the third sliced open his skull with a quick sword strike. The British crew rallied to the defence of their captain, and the third sailor was killed by a Royal Marine, and Shannon's crew stood firm to defend their captain, who sat dazed and very weak. A fellow sailor tended to Broke, applying as much aid as he could while his crew defended him. As the American crew was forced down below decks, Lieutenant Quark swore and cursed them, calling them cowards but admitting to a nearby midshipman that their situation was untenable. While the brutal fight for Chesapeake's deck was ongoing, crews in both the ship's fighting tops, the platforms where the main mast was connected to the topmast, battled it out. Snipers fired upon each other, and in particular in Shannon's case, her crew in the fighting tops swept Chesapeake's exposed deck so much that it was only manned by the dead. Leading Shannon's crew in the tops was Midshipman Smith. Acting on initiative, Smith led his men across the rigging and cleared the Chesapeake's fighting tops of men. At last, seemingly good luck graced the beleaguered crew of the Chesapeake, and the ships were torn apart by a squall, leaving the 50-strong boarding party stranded upon her deck, but alas it was too little too late for Chesapeake, and they were unable to take advantage of the situation. With the Shannon's boarding party in firm control of Chesapeake's upper decks, the American crew took refuge below, periodically offering resistance to British attempts to foray down into the decks of the ship. A single shot hit and killed the Royal Marine guarding the hatch, sparking the boarding party into a frenzy who fired their pistols and muskets into the hatch, killing men below. Witnessing how the situation was beginning to deteriorate, British Lieutenant Falkner restored order amongst his men, and the Americans below by threatening his own men with the death penalty if another fired, and secondly informing the American crew that the boarding party had total control of the Chesapeake, going so far as to bluff and inform the Americans that there were over 300 British sailors aboard, and any further attacks by the Americans would be met with their crews being shot one by one. This bluff worked, and the American crew surrendered, and Falkner received command of the USS Chesapeake as a captured prize. Almost simultaneously as the Chesapeake surrendered, Captain Broke fainted from blood loss, and after being rowed back to Shannon and regaining his consciousness, he wrote a full recount of the action. The action between Shannon and Chesapeake lasted approximately 10 to 11 minutes, varying between time measurement undertaken by the ship's log and Lieutenant Wallace. Broke, in typical fashion as was to him, decided to list a more modest 15 minutes when writing his dispatches to London. Unfortunately, the shortness of the action had no influence on low casualties between the two ships, with the crew of Shannon losing 23 men killed and 56 wounded, including her captain. The British casualties paled though in comparison to that of the Americans, who lost 48 killed, including almost all of their officers, and a further 99 wounded. The ships themselves were wounded too. Shannon received 158 recorded hits and Chesapeake 362. Broke's gunnery practice had proven its worth, with a 4-to-1 hit ratio in favour of Shannon, while the ships traded broadsides. In short, Chesapeake had undoubtedly lost the gunnery duel, which therefore lost to the battle. With the Chesapeake now firmly in British hands, the prize crew headed by Lieutenant Falkner began to have some serious issues with the American crew, who by now it must have been clear to them that they had been duped and there were not in fact 300 enemy sailors around them to keep them guard. Falkner, fearing an uprising, and rightly so, reacted very quickly. He shackled and sent the leaders amongst the American crew to Shannon in leg irons, which in a weird twist of fate were brought aboard the Shannon in Boston in the expectation that Chesapeake would be taking on an untold amount of British prisoners. As for the remaining American crewmen, Falkner had the hold they were being held in modified by cutting away 2 gun ports in the bulkhead and training 2 18-pounder long guns loaded with grape shot at the crew, rendering them completely docile. Broke, under no illusions that he was severely wounded, gave command of the Shannon to Lieutenant Wallace, and after effecting repairs to the Chesapeake in order to make her able to manoeuvre, set sail for Halifax. As the two ships entered port, Shannon was ahead, with the Chesapeake following nearby, and the British ships exuberantly lined their rails and manned their yards, cheering with each ship's band playing martial music as they all individually saluted Shannon for her stunning victory. All illusions of defeat must have left the American crew at this point, for the Chesapeake was now flying a smaller US ensign underneath an enormous British battle flag. The remaining 320 American crew were transferred from Shannon and Chesapeake onto Melville Island before, in what must be said to have been a kick to their pride, being loaded onto the now HMS Chesapeake and sailed to Dartmoor Prison in England. The very few surviving officers of Chesapeake were not amongst these men, however. They were given parole and stayed in Halifax, with some of them starting a riot when hearing a performance about the defeat of Chesapeake. Due to this, their parole was tightened, and once a month, they had to report. Failure to do so would mean confinement to prison quarters. The capture of Chesapeake was one of the first major real victories in the War of 1812 at sea by the Royal Navy, following a string of defeats. This victory vastly improved the morale of the British naval forces assigned to the North American and West Indies station, and proved again, like with Trafalgar some 8 years earlier, that the Royal Navy dominated the ocean. Shannon would sail from Halifax on the 5th of September 1813 for a very short and uneventful cruise under a new captain, before setting off for England on the 4th of October, carrying the recovering Broke. All their efforts in returning the Shannon and Chesapeake to Halifax intact, Lieutenant Wallace and Faulkner were promoted to the rank of commander, and all surviving midshipmen aboard Shannon were promoted to lieutenant. Captain Broke was made a baronet earlier in September and awarded the Freedom of the City by London City Council, along with a sword and cup valuing 100 guineas. Captain James Lawrence was buried with full military honours in a ceremony held in Halifax, with 6 British naval officers serving as pallbearers for his funerary service. His ship would survive in service with the Royal Navy until 1819 before being sold and broken up in Portsmouth, her timbers being sold off for profit, some of which were used to build a mill in Hampshire. Shannon would have a more eventful career following the battle. After reaching Portsmouth, Broke would be reassigned and Shannon would fall under the command of Commander Humphrey Senhouse in June 1813, and then would remain on station in Portsmouth until 1815, before being sent to Chatham to undergo overdue and expensive repairs and refit. Following this, Shannon would remain on station around Britain, changing captains every few years until in 1831, when she was reclassified as a receiving ship and temporary hulk. In 1844, Shannon was renamed to HMS St. Lawrence, before finally being broken up in 1859. It must be noted that a sister ship of HMS Shannon, well, 2 technically, but only one is fully rigged, HMS Trincomalee, remains afloat and a museum ship to this day in Hartlepool, proving that without a doubt, the sturdiness of the later class frigates can't be questioned. The captain which made her famous would never again command a ship at sea, his wounds so severe that they exposed his brain and led to the Shannon's doctor declaring them mortal during the fight. Broke would survive until the age of 64, suffering from headaches and neurological issues for his entire life. The victory of Shannon, as is stated above, provided a much-needed morale boost to the Royal Navy. However, the effects would be relatively short-lived due to the simple fact that the Royal Navy, while yes, gaining a very well-designed combat-capable frigate, was already miles ahead in the terms of sheer size of any of its adversaries. On the other hand, the loss of the Chesapeake heavily resonated within the still infant United States, which for the most part saw the loss of Chesapeake as a complete humiliation, causing a rapid loss of support for the continuation of the war, especially within New England, whose citizens began to demand the resignation of the sitting US President James Madison, who'd got them into the war in the first place. Historians have attributed the British success to a plethora of reasons, many of which are written not with objectivity but with patriotic sentiment in mind. This is both true within the United States and the United Kingdom. The later President Theodore Roosevelt would attack this notion, and would describe this example of revisionist history best by writing that after the first 2 minutes of the action, both Shannon and Chesapeake had suffered tremendous losses, with the key difference being the crew of Shannon stood firm, the crew of Chesapeake did not. Lawrence had clearly underestimated his opponent, but it must also be mentioned there was likely no single ship in the world better trained or captained at the time than HMS Shannon, in terms of crew training, gunnery, and even if she was undermanned and in need of refit after months at sea. Shannon's victory had 2 final consequences, because it showed that when the fight was not in favour of the larger American frigate designs, that a well-trained British crew could carry the day. This sentiment would prove true when the HMS Endymion went on to capture USS President not long thereafter, depriving the United States Navy of yet another vital core ship. Lastly, the final words of Captain Lawrence would be etched down in history as another incredibly patriotic rallying cry for the young American nation during the war. When the news of Lawrence's death reached his friend Admiral Oliver Hazard Perry, he would order a large blue ensign stitched with his famous quote. Perry would later have one of the 2 Niagara-class brigs named USS Lawrence in honour of the fallen commander, which he would command as his flagship at the Battle of Lake Erie, proudly flying the ensign with his friend's now famous last command. Overall, the Battle of Boston Harbour, the duel between these 2 frigates, although small, it had a profound effect on the now largely forgotten War of 1812, although it did not affect in any way the war's outcome. The 2 ships in under 15 minutes reversed the moral standings between the 2 opposing fleets, and left the young American nation feeling shocked and vulnerable. The action, born out of 2 commanders' agreement to combat, did come back to haunt the 2 men, with one of them dying in the fight, and the other fighting debilitating conditions for the remainder of his life. For those who made it to the end of what likely will be the longest video on this channel, thank you. Shout out to my awesome patrons, please join the Discord, like, comment, and subscribe. And one last thing I'll leave you with, is this entire chapter, this entire video, is taken from when I was a corporatist hellhole shill. I was working on a book, a history book, that included tales from different navies around the world. It's actually where the original script for my Russian Navy video, the first one, came from. And also the Battle of Lissa video, which quite a few of you have watched. If you guys would like more from this book that I was writing, I never actually published it and finished it, I also have sections on the Confederate raider, the CSS Alabama. I have stuff on the German raiders during the First World War, including the SMS Wolf and SMS Ziadler, and also the Russian cruiser Variag sinking during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So let me know if you would like me to delve into this a bit more. I'm probably never going to publish this book because, to be honest, I would rather write about something boring from 1500 that none of you probably want to listen to. So let me know, and like I said, like, comment, subscribe, shout out to the patrons, and I will catch you all next time.